Hey Meisner makers, it's Jennifer. It's Wednesday. It's 1 o'clock. You know what that means? Wednesday workshop at 1. So today we're going to do something a little different, and we're going to get started on a slightly larger project. So you're going to see this a couple of times on our Wednesday workshops. And what I want to share with you as we go through this, yes, the project is important, but more so, what are the techniques that are used and how can you apply them to things other than just this quilt top, which we're going to be stitching our way through. That pretty spring is just around the corner. I love the colors. I love I just love everything about this particular quilt top. So this is from the Garden Path Quilt, featuring the Painterly Garden fabric. Great center panel here. And what I'm really liking about that is not only the colors, but I'm loving that this is going to be such a great palette to play with for different free motion quilting techniques. So let's get started with this particular project and walk through a handful of techniques. So the first thing that I want to talk about is when we're working with a kit. Okay, this particular kit, and I'm just going to move these to the front here. It's in a little bit of disarray. Can you see that okay, cameraman Joel?
Yeah, I can see it.
All right. So inside of your kit, you're going to find a set of instructions, right? The pattern for the Garden Path Quilt. All of the fabric that you need to complete the quilt top is in here. And in your instructions, you're going to find that each fabric, let's put this out of the way, each fabric has a letter designation. So that when you go through your cutting information, if you simply follow along according to the fabric layouts here, it'll make it very quick work of getting everything cut. Now, if it were me, I would take my fabrics and I would literally lay them out in alphabetical order. So I would put fabric A, then I would find fabric B, fabric C, fabric D, and so on. That way, when I come over to my cutting instructions, fabric A is already laid out in the right spot, fabric B is next to it, fabric C, and so on. Now, when we're cutting our fabrics for our projects, this is a panel quilt, and panels sometimes can end up slightly askew when they are printed. So the instructions tell us to cut our panel to 32.5 by 32.5. So worry less about grain when you're cutting this and worry more about centering the design. Now, one of the nice things about this particular panel and the quilt pattern right at the 32.5 is it is almost exactly along the border of the panel when you pull your panel out of your quilt kit. Okay, so that's just one consideration there when you're working with panels is don't worry about grain, worry more about centering the actual motif itself. Now, the first part of the construction of this quilt calls for stitching 3 border strips. Okay, you're going to frame this 3 times. So if we get in here close, Joel, you can see we've got strip 1, strip 2, and strip 3. Now, the instructions are very specific in what size to cut these strips. And in real life, if this were a finished quilt, and I were putting border strips around, which is essentially what you're going to be doing for this piece, I would never simply rely on what the pattern tells me is the right size to cut the strip. So for example, this particular piece, it tells me I should cut my strips 1.5 inches wide by X long. Before I would ever cut strips that would be border strips, the first thing that I would do is measure my quilt in 3 to 4 places. Because on a pieced quilt, right, imagine this is a pieced quilt rather than a panel, sometimes my stitching can get a little off, or maybe my cutting was a little off. And so it might be 32.5 inches here, it might be 32.25 here, it might be 32.125 here, and some other number here. So I would measure in about 3 to 5 spots, and then I would take the average of that measurement, and that's what I would cut those strips to, those border strips. That way it's going to square up the piece that I'm working with. Now for our project today, because I did just cut this and I have not stitched anything else to it, and that will be the same situation for you if you're working on this particular panel quilt, I can feel confident that cutting the strips the size the pattern is telling me is going to be accurate. So from here, I'm going to cut the border strips, 1, 2, 3, according to my pattern instructions. All right, so I'll have these very lovely long lengths of 1 1/4 inch strips that I will then stitch side to side on my quilt or my panel, and then I'll stitch the one to the top and to the bottom. Make sure that you're using the 2 shorter strips for the first 2 sides that you stitch and the longer strips for the second sides, because as you add those first 2 borders, your panel piece is going to become just a little wider. So the larger strips need to be the ones, or the longer strips need to be the ones that you use for sides 3 and 4. Okay, so you'll follow the instructions and continue in that process. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about the cutting for those 1 1/4 inch strips, and also the cutting that we'll be doing to stitch our 4 patch blocks down here at the bottom. And we'll stitch those 4 patch blocks the next time that we get together. So our pattern is going to call for us to cut a certain width of fabric that we will then be joining to create those strips. Now, if you're using your rotary cutter and your mat at home, and cameraman Joel, we might want to get in a little closer for this one. I do want to talk to you about what it is that you should be looking at on your ruler and on your mat to make sure that your cuts are the most accurate. All right, now I mentioned that we were cutting a panel for the very center, and typically you're going to find a panel printed with, a lot of black space or some type of a different color around the panel edges. So the center panel also has these little ladybug squares, and the technique for cutting the panels is the same, whether it's that large center portion or these smaller ladybug squares. So our ladybug squares are going to be cut to 4 high, I believe, 4.5 tall by 5 inches wide. Now, if you remember, I mentioned that we want the design to be wet centered. We're not so concerned about grain line here. So when I looked at the panel, and my instructions say to cut 4.5 tall by 5 wide, the first thing that I'm going to do is measure the image or the design. And that design is about 4.5. So to get to 5, I'm just going to go out 1/4 inch from each side of the design and cut. So let me show you like so. Okay, we said we needed it to be 1/4 inch wider. So I'm going to align. What I'm lining up are these lines on the ruler itself. I'm not worried about what's happening on the mat. I just want to pay attention to the ruler and to my fabric. Turn this around. And now I'm going to use the lines on the mat as a rough guide. And I'm using the line again on my ruler, because I want that 1/4 inch so that I'll have the right width for my block. And then cut. Now, if I were cutting, and then I'm going to repeat for the other side because I already know it's 1/4 inch out. And what I'm using the lines on the mat for is really just to keep things running parallel, not for measurement. I'm using my ruler itself to do the measuring for me. 1/4 inch from the edge of the printing, run it around, and 1/4 inch again from the end of the printing. Okay, so that's how I would frame up and cut the panel portion squares. Okay, now for the strips that we'll be using for those 4 patch sections, I would take my fabric, press it. You're going to press it. And I don't like to cut more than 4 layers at a time. Okay, I just find that too much more than that and it becomes a little wonky where the folds are. I also like the edge that has the majority of the folds towards me. So here I've got double folds, here I have just one fold. And I'm going to line the folds up on a line on my mat. And this is just to keep it parallel. It has nothing to do with measuring. The measuring all comes from my ruler. So I'm going to slide my ruler over to the edge, and right now what I want to do is just square this up. I have the folds right underneath the line on the ruler. I want a little bit of pressure on the ruler, not a tremendous amount. This particular ruler by Quilter Select, this is nice. It's got a little grippy on the underneath side, so it makes it very easy for me to hold everything in place while I'm cutting. So I now have a nice straight line here, and I have a 90-degree angle here. So now I need to cut that 3-inch strip. Now I'm using a 3-inch ruler. If I wanted to cut something that was wider, let's say I'm cutting 5-inch strips, you'd want to use a ruler that's wider than this because you're using the ruler as your measurement device. So for example, let's say that we're cutting, for this ruler I can really only cut a 3-inch wide strip effectively, right? Because I want everything that I'm cutting to be underneath my ruler. So let's pretend we're cutting a 2-inch strip. I would first of all rotate my fabric around here so that it's justified the correct way for me. I have the edges parallel to, running right along, the markings on the mat. Okay, I still have my 90-degree angle, my nice straight edge. And then I'm using the lines on the ruler here to make sure I'm staying parallel. And here is my 2.5 inches, right? 1, 2.5. That half mark is going all the way down. It's going to be nice and even and consistent. It's all being covered up underneath the ruler so that should my rotary cutter go at all astray, my fabric strip will still be perfect. All right, there's my 2.5 inch. I'd move my ruler over, make sure that that line is running parallel to that fold, that coming down my edge here, it's running parallel to the measurement that I want. Keep my ruler in place and cut. Okay, the mat's just here to protect my surface and give me those parallel lines. The ruler is here to give me my measurements. This will help make your cutting more precise with all of your projects. Okay, makers, so you now have some tips for expert cutting. You have some hints for putting borders on your larger finished quilt pieces, and you've had a look at a just, I think, delightful for spring lap size quilt or wall hanging. If you want to follow along and stitch along with me, you will of course need your Garden Path kit. And with what we've covered today, you would be able to do all of your cutting and then stitch through steps 1, 2, and 3 of the construction process. And as always, if you have any questions, tips, hints, suggestions, or requests for future Wednesday workshop topics, please shoot me an email at info@meistersewing.com. Thank you.